There are moments in life that arrive disguised as ordinary seconds, moments that slip past us quietly, wearing the clothes of routine, until suddenly they reveal themselves as the pivotal points that divide our existence into before and after. For David Martinez, a successful corporate lawyer from Phoenix, that moment came wrapped in crumpled newspaper and tied with a shoelace on Christmas morning, 2019. He had no idea that inside that humble package lay something so powerful, it would shatter every assumption he'd built about success, fatherhood, and what it truly means to be rich. Picture this: a man who measured his worth in billable hours, whose phone buzzed with urgent emails even on Christmas Day, whose idea of quality time with his kids meant checking their report cards between conference calls. David thought he had life figured out: corner office, six-figure salary, respect from colleagues, a beautiful home in the suburbs. He was providing for his family in ways his own father never could, giving his children opportunities he'd only dreamed of as a kid. But sometimes the universe has a funny way of showing us that we've been looking at everything upside down. Sometimes it takes the innocent wisdom of a 7-year-old to reveal that the most valuable treasures can't be deposited in a bank account. That Christmas morning, as snow fell gently outside their living room window and the smell of cinnamon rolls wafted from the kitchen, David was about to receive a gift that would crack open his heart and completely rewrite his understanding of what it means to be a father. What could possibly be inside that simple, imperfectly wrapped box that would have such power? What could a child give to a man who seemed to have everything? The answer is both simpler and more profound than you might imagine, and by the end of this story, you'll never look at Christmas gifts the same way again. Dear viewer, check if you're still subscribed to the channel. Sometimes YouTube can unsubscribe you automatically, so it's always good to double-check. Take this chance to become a channel member too. As a member, you'll get awesome benefits like ad-free viewing of our content. Plus, you can help support us by using the thanks button. Your support allows us to invest in better tools and increase the quality of our content. Join us on this journey and be part of our community. Oh, and let us know in the comments which city you're listening from and what time it is there. We'd love to know. David woke up that Christmas morning the same way he'd woken up every day for the past 15 years, with his phone already in his hand, scrolling through emails that had accumulated overnight. Even on Christmas, even with his wife Sarah gently reminding him that work could wait just one day, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, somehow, someone needed him to respond to something urgent. It's funny how we convince ourselves that our constant availability makes us indispensable, when really it just makes us absent from the moments that actually matter. The house was already alive with the sounds of Christmas morning chaos. His 3 children, Emma, 12 years old and already showing signs of teenager eye-rolling; Marcus, 9 and bouncing off the walls with excitement; and little Sophie, 7 and still young enough to believe in magic, were gathered around the tree, their faces glowing with anticipation. Sarah had outdone herself again with the decorations, turning their living room into something that looked like it had been pulled straight from a holiday magazine. The tree was perfectly symmetrical, adorned with ornaments collected over years of family vacations and milestones, each one telling a story that David realized, with a pang of guilt, he barely remembered being part of. "Dad, put the phone away," Emma said with that particular tone that 12-year-olds have perfected, half pleading, half exasperated. "It's Christmas morning." David looked up from his screen, saw his daughter's face, and felt that familiar stab of recognition. When had Emma started looking so much older? When had those round, innocent eyes developed that knowing look that seemed to see right through his excuses? He slipped the phone into his pocket, but his fingers twitched toward it like a smoker trying to quit. The gift-opening ceremony began with the usual choreography that families develop over years of practice. Sarah played photographer and coordinator, making sure each child took turns, that thank you hugs were distributed, that the living room didn't descend into complete chaos. David sat in his usual spot, the big leather armchair that had been his father's day gift 3 years ago, and watched the proceedings with the detached air of someone observing rather than participating. He'd already mentally cataloged which gifts he'd purchased, which ones Sarah had picked out, how much each one had cost, and whether the recipient seemed appropriately grateful. Marcus tore through his presents with the focused intensity of a tornado, barely pausing to register what each gift was before moving on to the next. Emma approached hers with more deliberation, the careful consideration of someone who was starting to understand that childhood Christmas mornings were numbered. And Sophie, sweet, thoughtful Sophie, examined each present like she was studying a precious artifact, running her small fingers over the wrapping paper as if she could divine its contents through touch alone. David had always prided himself on being a provider. Growing up in a household where Christmas meant one small gift if they were lucky, where his father worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, he'd sworn that his children would never want for anything. Looking around the room at the mountain of boxes, bags, and bows, he felt a familiar satisfaction. Mission accomplished. His kids would never doubt that they were loved, never question whether their father cared about them, because the evidence was right there under the tree, purchased with hours he'd sacrificed and deals he'd closed. But there was something nagging at him as he watched his family that morning, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Maybe it was the way Marcus barely looked up when he said thank you. Maybe it was how Emma seemed more interested in taking pictures of her gifts than actually engaging with them. Or maybe it was the realization that he felt more like an ATM than a father, more like a sponsor of Christmas morning than an actual participant in it. Sarah caught his eye from across the room and smiled, that patient, knowing smile she'd perfected over their 16 years of marriage. She could read him like a book, could see the wheels turning in his head even when he thought he was being subtle. "Your turn," she said, gesturing to a small pile of gifts beside his chair. "The kids picked these out especially for you." David reached for the first package, a coffee mug from Marcus with "World's Okayest Dad" printed on the side. He chuckled and held it up for everyone to see, earning giggles from the kids and an eye roll from Sarah. The second gift was from Emma, a book about work-life balance that felt less like a present and more like an intervention. He flipped through the pages, noting the highlighted sections and sticky notes that Emma had already added. When had his 12-year-old daughter become so perceptive about his struggles? The third gift sat quietly in his lap, smaller than the others, wrapped in yesterday's newspaper comics and tied with what looked suspiciously like Sophie's shoelace from her sneakers. There was something different about this one, something that made David pause before unwrapping it. Sophie was watching him with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the size of the package, her dark eyes fixed on his face with an expectation that made him suddenly nervous. "This one's from Sophie," Sarah said unnecessarily, because somehow everyone in the room already knew that. There was a quality to the silence that had fallen over the family, as if they were all holding their breath for something. David looked at his youngest daughter, this little person who still believed in Santa Claus and fairy tales, who still crawled into his lap when thunderstorms scared her, who still thought her daddy could fix anything in the world. "What did you get me, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been all morning. Sophie just smiled, that mysterious, knowing smile that children sometimes wear when they have a secret they're dying to share, but want to savor the anticipation just a little longer. "Open it, Daddy," she whispered. David's fingers fumbled with the shoelace that served as ribbon, and he found himself wondering when he'd last sat on the floor with Sophie to tie her shoes. It's something really, really special. When he'd last been the one to help her get ready for school instead of calling out instructions from his office, while Sarah handled the morning routine. The newspaper wrapping crinkled in his hands. Comics, he realized, specifically the Sunday comics from last week that Sophie loved to read at the kitchen table while eating her cereal. She'd probably saved them just for this purpose, planning this moment with the kind of deliberate thoughtfulness that only children possess. As the paper fell away, David found himself holding a small wooden box. Nothing fancy or expensive looking, just a simple rectangular container that looked like it might have once held jewelry or keepsakes. The wood was worn smooth in places, as if it had been handled frequently, and there were tiny scratches and dings that spoke of age and use. David turned it over in his hands, surprised by how heavy it felt despite its small size, how warm the wood was against his palms. "Where did you get this, Sophie?" he he asked, but his daughter just bounced on her knees beside his chair, practically vibrating with excitement. "Open it, Daddy. Look inside." The enthusiasm in her voice was infectious, and David felt his own curiosity building despite himself. Around him, the rest of the family had gone quiet, even Marcus abandoning his new video game to watch what would happen next. The lid of the box was stuck, requiring a gentle twist and pull before it finally gave way with a soft pop. David lifted it carefully, not knowing what to expect, and found himself staring down at paper. Small pieces of paper, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, folded into tiny squares and packed into the box like precious gems. Each piece was different, some torn from notebooks, others cut from construction paper, a few that looked like they'd been carefully extracted from restaurant napkins or church bulletins. "What is this, sweetheart?" David asked, though something deep in his chest was already beginning to understand, already starting to recognize the magnitude of what he was holding. Sophie scrambled up onto the arm of his chair, her small hand covering his as he reached for one of the paper squares. "They're all the times," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "All the times you were the best daddy ever. I wrote them down so you wouldn't forget." Her words hit David like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs and making his vision blur slightly around the edges. You wrote them down?" he managed to ask, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. Sophie nodded solemnly. "Mama said you sometimes forget how good you are at being our daddy because you're always working so hard. So I started writing down all the good daddy moments, so when you forget, you can read them and remember." The simplicity of her explanation, the pure logic of a 7-year-old solution to her father's obvious struggle with self-worth, was almost more than David could process. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the first piece of paper. Written in Sophie's careful, still-developing handwriting were the words, "Daddy fixed my bike when the chain came off and didn't get mad even when it took a really long time." The date was there too, scrawled in the corner. A Saturday afternoon 3 months ago that David barely remembered, a 20-minute task that he'd squeezed in between phone calls and email responses. He reached for another paper, this one torn from a sticky note. "Daddy made pancakes shaped like hearts on my birthday morning." Another, "Daddy carried me to bed when I fell asleep watching movies and covered me with my favorite blanket." And another, "Daddy came to my school play even though he had to leave work early and he clapped the loudest." Each piece of paper was a moment that Sophie had witnessed, had deemed worthy of preservation, had carefully documented and stored away like treasure. Moments that David had lived through but hadn't really experienced, actions he'd performed while his mind was elsewhere, love he'd expressed without fully realizing its impact. Through his daughter's eyes, through her careful cataloging of their life together, he was seeing himself as she saw him, not as the absent, work-obsessed father he believed himself to be, but as someone who showed up, who cared, who made an effort even when it was inconvenient. "How long have you been collecting these?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie considered the question seriously, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Since I learned how to write better. Mama helped me with some of the words, but I remembered all the times by myself." The box, David realized, represented months of observation, months of a 7-year-old paying attention to her father's life, with the kind of detail that adults rarely afford each other. Sarah had moved closer during this exchange, and David looked up to see tears streaming down her face. She'd known about this project, had helped their daughter with spelling and encouragement, had watched Sophie carefully document moments that Sarah herself had probably taken for granted. "She worked on this for months," Sarah said softly. Every time you did something that made her happy, she'd run to her room and write it down. She wanted to make sure she got every single one. The weight of the box in David's hands felt different now, heavier than wood and paper had any right to be. This wasn't just a collection of memories. It was evidence of a relationship he'd thought was failing, proof of love he'd believed he wasn't adequately expressing, documentation of a fatherhood he'd convinced himself he was botching. And the most profound part was that it came from Sophie's perspective, from the person who would know better than anyone whether her father was present, whether he was caring, whether he was enough. What could happen next? How would this simple gift of carefully folded papers transform not just Christmas morning, but everything David thought he knew about his role as a father? David's hands shook as he continued to unfold paper after paper, each one revealing another moment that Sophie had deemed worth preserving. Daddy taught me how to tie my shoes and didn't give up even when I got frustrated. Daddy brought me soup when I was sick and read me 3 extra stories. Daddy danced with me in the kitchen when my favorite song came on the radio. With each revelation, the picture of his fatherhood that existed in Sophie's mind became clearer, and it looked nothing like the picture he'd been carrying in his own head. The papers weren't just random memories. They were organized, intentional, spanning months of careful observation. Some were dated recently, others went back almost a year. David began to recognize patterns in Sophie's documentation, clusters of papers from particularly difficult periods in his work life when he'd felt most absent from his family. Somehow, even during his busiest seasons, even when he'd been convinced he was failing as a father, Sophie had been watching, noticing, recording evidence of his love. Daddy came to my soccer game on Saturday morning even though he looked really tired. That paper made David's chest tight. He remembered that morning, dragged himself out of bed after working until 2 a.m., nearly talked himself out of going because he had 3 cases to review before Monday. He'd sat on those cold metal bleachers feeling like he was barely functioning, like he was just going through the motions of parenting. But Sophie had seen something different. Sophie had seen a father who showed up. Another paper. Daddy helped me with my math homework and made it fun by using candy to count with. David remembered that evening too. He'd been frustrated, impatient, juggling homework help with a client who kept calling. He'd thought he'd done a terrible job, that Sophie could sense his distraction and annoyance. But in her memory, in her careful documentation, that evening had been worth preserving because he'd found a way to make math enjoyable, because he'd prioritized her learning over his own convenience. Daddy surprised me with ice cream after my dentist appointment because he knew I was scared. Daddy let me help him wash the car and didn't get mad when I got more soap on myself than on the car. Daddy tucked me in every single night this week and sang the song about the mockingbird. Each paper was a testament to small acts of love, ordinary moments that Sophie had recognized as extraordinary simply because they came from her father's heart. Marcus and Emma had moved closer now, reading the papers over David's shoulder, their faces reflecting a growing understanding of what they were witnessing. "Dad," Emma said quietly, "I didn't know Sophie was doing this." Her voice carried a note of something that might have been regret, or perhaps recognition. Recognition that maybe she'd been too quick to judge her father's efforts, too ready to focus on his absences rather than his presence. Marcus, typically the family comedian, had gone uncharacteristically serious. "Sophie, this is like really cool," he said, his 9-year-old vocabulary inadequate for the magnitude of what his little sister had accomplished. "You wrote down all the good stuff Dad does." Sophie nodded proudly, pleased that her brothers and sister were finally understanding the scope of her project. David found himself thinking about perception, about the stories we tell ourselves about our own lives versus the stories that others might tell about us. For months, maybe years, he'd been constructing a narrative of his own inadequacy as a father. He worked too much, was present too little, provided financially but failed emotionally. He'd been so focused on his shortcomings that he'd become blind to his successes, so convinced of his failures that he couldn't see his victories. But here was Sophie, his youngest child, the one who would be most affected by his absences, most hurt by his distraction, and she'd been living in a completely different story. In Sophie's story, David wasn't the absent father he believed himself to be. He was the daddy who showed up, who cared, who made time even when time was scarce. Her story wasn't about what he failed to do. It was about what he actually did, consistently, lovingly, even when he didn't realize the impact of his actions. One paper near the bottom of the box made David's breath catch in his throat. "Daddy said he was proud of me for helping Mommy with dinner, and he gave me the biggest hug." The date on this one was from a particularly dark period in David's career, when he'd been working 18-hour days on a case that eventually fell through. when he'd felt like everything he touched turned to failure. He barely remembered that evening, but Sophie had captured it, had seen through his exhaustion and stress to the father who still had love to give, who still noticed when his daughter did something kind. The revelation wasn't just about Sophie's perception, it was about the power of attention, the way that love shows up in small, consistent acts rather than grand gestures. David had been waiting for some moment of perfect fatherhood, some occasion when he could prove his love definitively. But Sophie's collection showed him that love wasn't about perfection. It was about presence, about showing up imperfectly but consistently, about caring enough to try even when you're tired, stressed, or overwhelmed. Sarah reached over and squeezed David's shoulder, her touch grounding him in the moment. "She sees you, David," she whispered. "She really sees you." And for the first time in years, David was beginning to see himself through his daughter's eyes, not as the father he thought he should be, but as the father he actually was. As David continued to work his way through Sophie's carefully curated collection, a profound shift began to occur in his understanding of success, of fatherhood, of what it means to build a meaningful life. Each paper was like a small mirror, reflecting back moments he'd lived but not truly seen, actions he'd taken but not fully valued. The cumulative effect was overwhelming, not just the number of papers, but the span of time they represented, the consistency of love they documented, the evidence of a relationship that was thriving even when he'd been convinced it was failing. "Daddy let me stay up late to see the full moon and explained why it looked so big." That paper transported David back to a September evening when Sophie had been too excited to sleep, when he'd made the decision to abandon his usual bedtime routine and step outside with her instead. He'd pointed out constellations, made up stories about the man and the moon, let her ask endless questions about space and stars and why the sky changes colors. At the time, he'd felt guilty about keeping her up past her bedtime, worried that Sarah would disapprove, anxious about the work emails piling up in his inbox. But Sophie had seen it differently. She'd seen a daddy who chose wonder over routine, who valued her curiosity over his own schedule. The papers began to reveal patterns that David hadn't recognized before. Many of Sophie's favorite memories involved moments when he'd chosen flexibility over rigidity, when he'd said yes instead of no, when he'd put her needs ahead of his own convenience. "Daddy stopped working on his computer to help me find my stuffed elephant. Daddy drove back to the restaurant to get my toy that I forgot. Daddy played pretend tea party with me and used his funny grown-up voice for all the stuffed animals." These weren't grand gestures or expensive gifts. They were small pivots, tiny course corrections where David had chosen connection over efficiency, presence over productivity. And somehow, Sophie had been aware enough to recognize these moments as gifts, mature enough to understand that time and attention were more valuable than any store-bought present. David found himself thinking about legacy, about the kind of father he wanted to be remembered as. But Sophie's papers were showing him a different kind of legacy, one built through accumulated moments of care, through consistent small choices to prioritize relationship over responsibility. He'd always assumed that legacy was built through achievement, through providing opportunities and financial security, through setting an example of hard work and professional success, through the daily decision to see his children not as additional items on his to-do list, but as the most important work he'd ever do. Daddy came to my parent-teacher conference and asked lots of questions about how to help me with reading. That paper hit David particularly hard because he remembered feeling completely out of his depth at that conference, worried that he didn't know enough about Sophie's academic life, convinced that Sarah was the real expert on their children's educational needs. He'd asked questions because he felt inadequate, but Sophie had interpreted his questions as evidence of caring, his concern as proof of love. The realization dawning on David was both simple and revolutionary. His children didn't need him to be perfect, they needed him to be present. They didn't need him to have all the answers, they needed him to care enough to ask questions. They didn't need him to provide everything, they needed him to provide himself, his attention, his time, his authentic engagement with their lives. Marcus had been quietly reading papers over David's shoulder, and suddenly he spoke up. "Dad, can I make one of these boxes too? Like for Mom." The question revealed something beautiful. Not only had Sophie's gift moved David, but it had inspired Marcus to think about documenting love, about paying attention to the ways their mother showed care, and creating something tangible to honor those moments. Emma, typically more reserved with her emotions, had tears in her eyes. "Sophie, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she said, her voice thick with feeling. You're like a love detective or something." The description made Sophie giggle, but it was remarkably accurate. She had been detecting love, finding it in places where even David himself hadn't recognized it, documenting it with the precision of a scientist and the heart of a poet. David looked around at his family, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time in months. Sarah, who had supported Sophie's project and kept it secret, who had watched her youngest daughter carefully observe and document her father's love with the patience and wisdom that had made David fall in love with her 16 years ago. Emma, who was old enough to understand the significance of what Sophie had accomplished, mature enough to recognize the beauty in her sister's gesture. Marcus, whose immediate instinct was to create something similar for their mother, showing an emotional intelligence that David was only just beginning to appreciate. And Sophie, sitting beside his chair with her legs swinging, watching his face with the satisfied expression of someone who had planned a surprise and seen it land exactly as intended. She had given him more than a collection of memories. She had given him a new lens through which to view his own life, a different story about his fatherhood, a profound gift of perspective that would change how he saw himself forever. The papers in the box weren't just documentation of the past, they were a roadmap for the future, showing David that the moments that mattered most were often the ones he was most likely to overlook. They were proof that love accumulates in small increments, that presence is more powerful than perfection, that his children were watching and learning, and loving him not despite his imperfections, but including them. The immediate aftermath of Sophie's gift created a palpable shift in the energy of their Christmas morning, as if the entire family had suddenly recalibrated around a new understanding of what they meant to each other. David found that he couldn't put the box down, couldn't stop reading and rereading the papers, each one revealing new layers of meaning with every examination. The simple act of seeing his fatherhood through Sophie's eyes had created a cascade of realizations that extended far beyond his relationship with her. Emma, who had been growing increasingly distant as she navigated the choppy waters of adolescence, seemed to soften as she watched her father's emotional response to Sophie's gift. "Dad," she said quietly, moving to sit on the floor beside his chair, "I never really thought about all the little things you do. I guess I was mostly thinking about the times you weren't there." Her admission was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Heartbreaking because it confirmed David's fears about his absence, but hopeful because it suggested that perspective could shift, that relationships could be repaired and deepened. David reached out and touched Emma's hair, a gesture so natural and unconscious that it surprised them both. "I want to be there more," he said, and for the first time in months, the words didn't feel like an empty promise. Sophie's gift had shown him that being there wasn't just about physical presence. It was about attention, about choosing to engage fully in the moments he did have with his children. "I want to learn how to see the good things the way Sophie does." Marcus, never one to be left out of an emotional moment, climbed into David's lap despite being almost too big for such gestures. "Dad, maybe we could all make boxes for each other," he suggested. "Like, we could write down the good things everyone does, and then we could read them when we're sad or something." The idea was brilliant in its simplicity, creating a family practice of noticing and documenting love, of paying attention to the ways they cared for each other rather than focusing on the ways they disappointed each other. Sarah had been watching this unfold with the expression of someone witnessing a miracle she'd hoped for but hadn't dared expect. "You know," she said carefully, "Sophie came to me about 6 months ago and asked why Daddy always looked sad when he came home from work. She was worried that maybe he didn't like being our daddy anymore." The revelation hit David like a physical blow. The idea that his 7-year-old daughter had been concerned about his happiness, had been trying to solve a problem she didn't fully understand. I told her that Daddy loves being our daddy more than anything, but that sometimes grown-ups forget how good they are at the things that matter most, Sarah continued. That's when she got the idea to help you remember. She said if she wrote down all the times you were the best daddy, then you could read them when you forgot. The sophistication of Sophie's solution, the emotional intelligence required to recognize the problem and devise a way to address it, left David speechless. Sophie, who had been listening to this conversation with the serious expression of someone whose work was being discussed, suddenly smiled. "Did it work, Daddy? Do you remember now that you're a good daddy?" Her question was so direct, so earnest, that David felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart," he managed to say. "It worked. You helped me remember something really important." But even as he said the words, David realized that Sophie's gift had done more than help him remember. It had taught him something entirely new about the nature of love, about the way children perceive their parents, about the profound impact of small, consistent acts of care. The ripple effects continued throughout the morning and into the afternoon. When extended family arrived for Christmas dinner, David found himself telling the story of Sophie's gift, his voice thick with emotion as he described his daughter's months-long project. His sister remarked that she'd never seen him look so moved by anything, and his mother, who had often worried about David's work-life balance, wept openly as she understood the magnitude of what her granddaughter had accomplished. But the most significant change was in David himself. He put his phone in a drawer and left it there for the entire day. When Marcus wanted to show him a new trick on his skateboard, David didn't just glance up from his laptop. He went outside and watched, really watched, asking questions and cheering enthusiastically. When Emma mentioned a book she was reading for school, David asked about the plot, the characters, what she thought about the author's message. When Sophie wanted to play dress-up, David found himself sitting on her bedroom floor, allowing her to put makeup on his face and style his hair while she chattered about her plans to become a princess veterinarian astronaut. Sarah noticed the change immediately. "You're different," she said that evening as they cleaned up the remnants of Christmas morning. "You're here, really here." David looked at his wife, this woman who had loved him through his workaholism and his anxiety, who had raised their children with grace and patience while he'd been busy convincing himself that financial provision was equivalent to emotional presence. "Sophie showed me something I couldn't see on my own," he said. "She showed me that I'm already the father I've been trying so hard to become. I just needed to pay attention." The realization felt both humbling and liberating. Humbling, because it revealed how much time he'd wasted worrying about his inadequacies, and liberating, because it suggested that the path to better fatherhood wasn't about dramatic change, but about recognizing and building on what was already working. That night, as David tucked Sophie into bed, she wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, "Daddy, I'm so happy you liked your present. Now you know what I know, that you're the best daddy in the whole world." As he turned off her light and closed her door, David realized that the gift Sophie had given him would keep giving for the rest of his life. She had taught him to see his own fatherhood with the eyes of love rather than the eyes of judgment. And that shift in perspective would change everything about how he moved through the world as a parent. In the weeks and months that followed that Christmas morning, the changes in David's life weren't dramatic or sudden. They were subtle, consistent, and deeply rooted in the new understanding that Sophie's gift had provided. He didn't quit his job or abandon his professional responsibilities, but he did begin to approach both work and family with a different set of priorities, a clearer understanding of what success actually looked like when measured against the things that truly mattered. The wooden box took up permanent residence on David's desk at work, positioned where he could see it every time he looked up from his computer. Colleagues began to notice that David seemed more focused during meetings, more decisive about what truly required his immediate attention, and more likely to leave the office at a reasonable hour. When asked about the change, David would simply gesture to the box and say, "My daughter helped me remember what I'm working for." But the real transformation happened at home, in the accumulation of small moments that began to mirror the ones Sophie had so carefully documented. David started a practice of putting his phone in the kitchen drawer when he arrived home each evening, creating a boundary between work time and family time that hadn't existed before. The first few days were difficult. His fingers would twitch toward his pocket, his mind would race with thoughts of emails that might be waiting. But gradually, the anxiety faded, replaced by a sense of presence and peace he hadn't experienced in years. Emma, initially suspicious of her father's newfound attention, gradually began to open up in ways that surprised them both. Their conversations, once limited to logistics and homework checks, expanded to include her thoughts on books, her concerns about friendships, her dreams about the future. David discovered that his 12-year-old daughter had developed complex opinions about social justice, environmental protection, and the nature of happiness. Topics they'd never discussed because he'd never thought to ask, never created the space for such conversations to unfold. Marcus, energized by his father's increased presence, began seeking David out for activities they'd never shared before. Together, they built a treehouse in the backyard, a project that stretched over several weekends and involved numerous trips to the hardware store, countless YouTube tutorials, and more than a few mistakes that became sources of laughter rather than frustration. The treehouse itself was imperfect, slightly crooked, with gaps in the planking and a door that didn't quite close properly, but it became a symbol of their evolving relationship, a physical manifestation of time invested and attention paid. Sophie, delighted by her father's transformation, began creating new projects to document their ongoing relationship. She started a photo album of Daddy and Me adventures, carefully arranging pictures of their Saturday morning pancake sessions, their evening walks around the neighborhood, their impromptu dance parties in the living room. Sarah, who had carried the emotional labor of the household for so many years, found herself with a true partner in parenting, someone who noticed when groceries were running low, who remembered parent-teacher conferences without being reminded. Each photo was accompanied by Sophie's commentary, written in her still-developing handwriting, creating an ongoing narrative of their life together. The impact extended to David's marriage as well, who took initiative in planning family activities and maintaining relationships with extended family. Their conversations, once dominated by logistics and scheduling, began to include dreams, hopes, and reflections on the kind of family they wanted to create together. David started a tradition of box nights, where the family would gather to share their own collections of good moments, not necessarily written down like Sophie's, but spoken aloud, acknowledged, and celebrated. Each family member would share something beautiful they'd noticed about another family member during the week, creating a practice of intentional appreciation that strengthened their bonds and helped them all develop the habit of looking for love rather than focusing on shortcomings. When David faced difficult decisions at work, whether to take on a case that would require extensive travel, whether to attend a networking event that would conflict with Marcus's soccer game, whether to work late or come home for dinner, he would think about Sophie's papers. The wooden box also became a teaching tool, about the moments that had mattered enough for her to preserve them. The question that guided his choices became not, what will advance my career, but what would be worth writing on a piece of paper and saving forever? Professional success didn't disappear from David's life, but it was redefined. He discovered that working with clearer priorities and better boundaries actually made him more effective during his work hours. His reputation for being reliable and thorough was enhanced by his new ability to focus completely on the task at hand, knowing that he would be fully present for his family when he got home. The integration of work and life became less about balance, a word that had always felt elusive and anxiety-provoking, and more about alignment, ensuring that his professional efforts supported rather than undermined his deeper values. As Sophie grew older, her gift continued to evolve. She began writing letters to her future self, documenting not just her father's actions, but her own growth, her changing understanding of family and love, her expanding awareness of the world beyond their home. The practice of paying attention, of noticing and preserving moments of beauty and connection, became a family value that shaped how all of them moved through the world. David often reflected on the paradox of Sophie's gift, how something so simple could be so profound. how a 7-year-old's innocent project could accomplish what years of therapy, self-help books, and good intentions had failed to achieve. The lasting legacy of that Christmas morning wasn't just a changed father or a strengthened family. It was a new understanding of how love actually works in daily life, how it accumulates through small actions and consistent presence. The answer, he came to understand, lay in the power of perspective, in the gift of seeing himself through the eyes of someone who loved him unconditionally, who noticed his efforts rather than his failures, who valued his presence more than his perfection. How it's often most visible to those who are looking for it, rather than those who are performing it. Sophie's wooden box became a symbol not just of one child's creativity, but of the profound truth that we are often better than we believe ourselves to be, more loved than we can imagine, and more successful at the things that matter most than our own harsh judgments would suggest. David's story reminds us that sometimes the most transformative gifts come in the simplest packages, wrapped not in expensive paper, but in the patient observation of someone who loves us enough to see our goodness when we can't see it ourselves. Sophie's wooden box of carefully folded papers did more than document her father's actions. It revealed a profound truth about the nature of parenthood, of love, and of the way we often underestimate our own positive impact on the lives of others. The beauty of Sophie's gift lies not just in what she collected, but in how she collected it, with the eyes of love rather than the eyes of judgment, with attention to presence rather than absence, with gratitude for what was rather than resentment for what wasn't. Her 7-year-old wisdom teaches us that love is often most clearly visible to those who are actively looking for it, who choose to notice and celebrate the small acts of care that make up the fabric of family life. As you think about your own relationships, with your children, your parents, your spouse, your friends, consider what might be in your own wooden box if someone who loved you began collecting evidence of your goodness. What small acts of kindness might they have noticed that you've forgotten? Maybe it's time to create your own version of Sophie's gift, not necessarily a physical collection, but a practice of paying attention to the love that surrounds you, of noticing the ways that people in your life show care. What moments of presence might they have treasured that you dismissed as ordinary? What consistent patterns of love might they have documented that you've overlooked in your focus on your perceived failures? Of documenting and celebrating the small moments that make up the real substance of relationship. Maybe it's time to become a love detective in your own life, seeking out evidence of connection and kindness rather than cataloging disappointments and shortcomings. And perhaps most importantly, maybe it's time to put down the phone, step away from the distractions that convince us we're indispensable elsewhere, and show up fully for the people who matter most. Because the truth that Sophie understood so clearly is that love isn't measured in grand gestures or perfect moments. It's built through the accumulation of small choices to be present, to pay attention, to prioritize relationship over everything else that seems urgent, but isn't actually important. The gift that changed David forever wasn't really about the past. It was about the future, about the possibility of seeing himself and his relationships through the eyes of love, about the power of presence and the profound impact of simply showing up. What would your life look like if you could see yourself the way someone who loves you sees you? What would change if you started collecting evidence of your own goodness instead of building cases against yourself? Maybe this Christmas, the greatest gift you could give or receive is the gift of perspective, the ability to see love where it already exists, to notice presence instead of absence, to celebrate the small moments that, when added together, create a life worth living and relationships